Hello everyone and welcome to the public space. Today we have a frame game report, the third and probably the last in this series where we look at Starbucks. So as a reminder, we've looked at how two guys in Starbucks have triggered a whole change at Starbucks. We've looked behind the scenes in what kind of organizations were backing these diversity changes at Starbucks, who benefited from it, and in many cases, well, Starbucks seems to be involved in essentially buying out peace in this industry that diversity has become. So Frame Games now brings us a report where we will go deeper. We will look at what kind of strategies has been applied and what kind of strategies are applied in general in the diversity industry. Frame Games, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, JF. Thanks for having me back. Excited for this particular chapter. It's a fun one.
Me too. So going deeper, what are you going to talk about today?
All right, so I think first I'm just going to summarize where we are in the story, and I think this will be the last chapter in the Starbucks specific saga. But I want a lot of the life lessons from this trilogy just to stick with people, and so I'm going to just start with a little opening the segment that I prepared, which is first to say that why you should care about this Starbucks series, which is to say that this is a flashpoint from which to understand the totality of how diversity politics affects your life, your business, and the world around you. And what we're going to cover today, I'll kind of cut to the chase first of what the sort of big reveal is, which is that Starbucks is not a coffee company. They are a real estate company, and they buy real estate in the most expensive, coveted land in America, the urban inner and center city. Starbucks are not cucks. They are powerful neo-colonialists negotiating with the natives, so to speak. So, JF, one of the things I like to stress very often is the dividing line between being, say, a cuck and being what I typically call a high sparrow, somebody who uses diversity politics as their path to power and may sometimes engage in that sort of surrendering cuckish behavior. But it's really kind of a Machiavellian way to abuse diversity politics and use it to your personal advantage. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And so are you saying they are ice sparrows?
Yes. So here is how it works, and then we're going to talk in specifics. Starbucks learned that to win the inner city coffee game, they could bribe local officials and community leaders into giving them virtually unlimited licenses to operate and buy real estate in big cities, even if that meant gentrifying neighborhoods with poor Black and Hispanic majorities who deeply resent Starbucks and are deeply ethnocentric peoples. The racial minorities don't want Starbucks there. And Starbucks, as through something we'll cover, which is called the Starbucks effect in real estate circles, is the leading gentrification indicator in the world.
But
Maybe I'll
I
just
tend
talk
to
about that.
think of Starbucks as a symptom. Are you telling me that Starbucks is the actor of gentrification?
They are both, but they are often the actors because they act in concert with real estate developers and city council members, as well as community boards who they happen to pay millions of dollars to. And in fact, the best thing, one of the things we'll cover here today is that they're totally busted. I mean, they have it in their own CSR, corporate social responsibility annual reports, how their philanthropy has gotten them licenses to operate in places that would otherwise hate them.
Okay.
But yes, what
So
they
not
do
not
is
only is the
Mhm.
coffee shop implementing itself and it has an effect on the town, but the fact that they recruit municipal people and the fact that they shape the political landscape will also contribute to other gentrification that's completely unrelated to coffee.
Oh yes, it's completely unrelated to coffee, and in fact, a lot of their value is tied up in the amount of real estate that they own. And what they're doing is they're basically buying. They're one of the first actors. There's something called the Starbucks effect. I've got a bunch of YouTube tabs I can show you links for to talk about this more specifically. But if we want to just talk about it briefly, it's that statistical measures have confirmed time and again that the nearer you are to a Starbucks, the more rapidly your housing value will increase. Because
Wow.
what Starbucks does is they buy property in neighborhoods that are sort of initially on the edge of the wealthier, whiter parts of big cities. And then they team up with real estate development companies, or often CDCs, community development corporations, uh, and as well as city and urban planners to basically lead gentrification projects that help other businesses and predominantly white, wealthier people to move into the neighborhood. And what this does is this basically kicks the Black and Hispanic people out. And it's for this reason that Starbucks is perhaps the most hated company in the world with respect to gentrification. Um, but beyond gentrification, which we'll get to in specific, Starbucks sells overpriced coffee at price points most Black and Hispanic locals can't afford. It doesn't fit with their culture, and Starbucks' competitive advantage comes in part from cluster bombing neighborhoods. You know, that phenomenon where you see like, you know, 10, they'll open up 30, or 30 branch locations in 10 days when they move into a city, right? It's like every block will have one, and there's even that joke that I think The Onion did a couple years ago where Starbucks was opening new Starbucks stores in their own bathroom because of how many they open up at a time.
I
So
remember
they
being
do
a scientist and buying at Starbucks. I make more money than I used to, but I wouldn't buy at Starbucks right now because I've become more clever with my money. But when I was a scientist going around various towns, sometimes I was stuck in having not many options and needing something quick, and I would buy something at Starbucks.
yeah, yeah. Well, what they do is you'll often find, and in fact, I challenge the chat next time. I've started doing this since I've done my sort of investigative work on this particular topic. Whenever I see a Starbucks now, I stop and I do a 360 and I turn around and I see if I can find any other coffee shop that's not a Starbucks within view. And with extremely rare exception, it's always so weird that whenever I see a Starbucks, it's the only Starbucks nearby. It's the only coffee place nearby. I thought this was really weird at first. And then I started to read the annual reports and more of the corporate strategy and analyst reports on Starbucks' business model and how they rose to prominence. And what they do is they cluster bomb neighborhoods. So they don't just open up shop, they invade. And this leads to supersaturation plus something called cannibalization, where their goal is to get so many Starbucks coffee shops in town that they start cannibalizing profit off itself rather than off of other coffee shops nearby.
And so
Plus, this
there's
goes
no
hand.
place left in the center for any competition since they're already pushing themselves to the limit with this cannibalization.
Well, and it gets worse. The other thing they do is they negotiate exclusivity clauses all the time. Starbucks, in fact, I can show you links. Starbucks real estate negotiators, that's real estate representatives, and yes, kind of weird, right? Like, why does you think Starbucks is hiring baristas and like branch managers? They have a whole department dedicated to real estate negotiation, and they're paid the highest in the business. I think they make $132,000 a year just for negotiating. Just for a person who's paid full time to negotiate real estate contracts. And the
Okay.
things that they negotiate most are these exclusivity clauses that forbid nearby shops or near anyone in the same development from serving hot drinks like coffee or tea. So you got this one-two punch where they cluster bomb the neighborhood, and then they forbid other people from selling the goods that Starbucks sells. Now you can imagine what this does in a Black and Hispanic neighborhood where they take a lot of pride in their ethnic, cultural traditions, like the way that their local food, the local community. So normally, a community board or local city council would reject Starbucks' applications to set up shop in their part of town, and this is the job of a city council, and this is something that community boards are elected to do, basically, to determine, who gets licenses to operate in their area.
The
But
development
Starbucks is
priorities, as administrators like to call them.
Yes, yes, that development priorities, as well as everything from zoning to the way the Commission on Urban Planning is going to work with the various community boards to. Um, y- y- anyway, I can get into that, but Starbucks has mastered this trick that's called strategic corporate responsibility, or as I like to call it, weaponized philanthropy. Um, Another way to describe it is community investment scamming, and what that involves is Starbucks seeming to bend over ass backwards to give philanthropy to these underprivileged Black and Hispanic communities largely. But that money is actually going to the local church leaders and the local city councilmen and community boards in order to purchase basically long term licenses to operate in the area. This is for anyone who's familiar with the uh, 2008 financial crisis. Are you aware, JF, of the Community Reinvestment Act? Uh, does
Not
that
this
say
act,
it's
no. Is it the crisis
okay?
related to real estate?
Yes. So there was a crisis moment in the diversity industry in 2008 when uh, people caught on to the fact that there was this little obscure law that normies didn't really know much about called the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977. And what it did was it became armed during it was basically dormant for about 15, 16 years. It was passed in order to get big banks and financial institutions to invest in the urban areas that they did business. And sorry, one second. And it ended up getting weaponized into requiring banks to make subprime loans or lower their credit standards in order to meet certain quotas, essentially, for community reinvestment so that they could get licenses to operate in urban areas and so that they could get approvals for mergers and other sorts of regulatory approvals. What it was is it was Steve Saylor covers this in a series he calls the Minority Mortgage Meltdown. And basically, it explains how it came to pass that the subprime loan industry was created, why the banks got rid of all their lending standards all of a sudden beginning in 2001. And I was intending to tell that story a little bit later in the presentation, but let me just sort of conclude the initial sort of introductory statement by saying Starbucks essentially acts today the same way that big banks acted in the lead up to the 2008 financial crisis, paying off local community leaders and in order to get regulatory approval and in order to get zoning licenses, while seemingly on the surface doing it all for diversity. But the end result is the same thing in Starbucks as it was in 2008. Black and Hispanic people getting kicked out of their homes. They're neo colonialists. Um, so I'll pause now, but
Now I wonder the extent of this parallel that you're establishing. So, are you saying that there is also a parallel between the real estate crisis and what Starbucks does, in the sense that Starbucks has very low standard for acquisition of real estate, or is it just similar in the sense that they recruit local politicians?
it's similar in the sense that they recruit local politicians. Not that
Okay.
they are very, in fact, they are famous for exploiting demographic trends in how they buy real estate. In fact, they have this in their own materials how they optimize based on demographics. Now they don't say racial demographics necessarily, but what they do is they take a part of town that is in the earliest stages of gentrification. Maybe it is a part of town that has been downtrodden for a very long period of time, and then there's new signs of life, or there's a new deal announced with some community revitalization project, and then they will put a dart on the board in that part of town and say, okay, we're going to own this part of town, we're going to set up 10 Starbucks here, and basically we're going to be the only place to buy coffee in the city here.
And then it takes
as well as
value
basically.
because white people come in, leftists come in, people start renovating old garages into hippie bar, and then everything gains value.
Right. And in fact, it's, sort of famous for saying that the area is safe, right? There's not a lot of, you don't associate Starbucks with, like gang related violence happening, on the sidewalk nearby. I mean, it does have that symbiotic effect in part because of how they work with real estate developers. But no, the analogy to the 2008 financial crisis is, in fact, maybe we'll start with that. I wanted to start with a few other things, but um, I think since that's maybe the boldest claim that I made in the intro here, that we'll start with it.
All right.
So I initially became interested in the real estate angle because of a Starbucks that had been. I was on their website and I was looking at how they announced that they were doing 15 community run stores that they were opening in the sort of the blackest of neighborhoods and sort of the most Hispanic of neighborhoods in America, and that they were doing it as a sort of quasi charity operation where all of the stores would be staffed. If it was in a black neighborhood, it would be staffed by black people. That all of the goods purchased would be through black owned vendors. The whole thing, top to bottom. I can send you some links so that you're sort
Wow.
of on the same
Seems
page with me if you're
complicated.
interested.
Seems quite complicated to organize that kind of thing when you have a chain of distribution that's all isolated and well oiled.
So here you go. I just sent you the link in the lobby. It's less complicated than you'd think because of how it works. I was really interested when I saw this to see basically a case study and how exactly this would work. Yeah, I guess I had the same impulse as you. Like how exactly are they going to pull this off? They also claimed that I think maybe 10 cents of every dollar in profit would be reinvested back into the community, meaning paying the local community board members, paying for
Okay.
their initiatives so that they could get more access. So, and then I looked to see, well, what were they doing in Brooklyn? And I saw that they had teamed up with a local community partner, as they call the people that they pay, um, named the Abyssinian Development Corporation. That was going to be their local black owned business, basically that they were going to do business with for this. And I thought, I wonder what the Abyssinian Development Corporation does. And so I'm going to send you another link now because this will sort of take us into the real kind of first act of the story here. Um, Hold on, give me a second.
By the way, I'm not illustrating the links to you because I'm trying to save CPU given the past troubles we've had, but the crowd is seeing
Yeah,
them,
sure.
so don't worry about this.
Sounds good. All right. So I just sent it to you in the lobby. And this is just a link to, you can find this speech online a million places, but this is just on Steve Saylor's website. And this was a speech that a sort of white leftist who used to be very involved with Obama made about what he thought was in store for Obama's presidency. And he talks about if you run a search for real estate reverend in the article, it's about 5 paragraphs down.
Yeah,
It's
the
the
liberal
paragraph that starts.
foundations, the elite universities, the non-profit community
Mhm.
developers, and the real estate's
Yep.
reverence.
Right. So the Abyssinian Development Corporation, this speech helped me put some things together here. The Abyssinian Development Corporation, when I looked into it, it pulled up an article about a man named Calvin Butts, who was supposed to be the anti Al Sharpton, basically a black civil rights leader that white people felt a lot more comfortable doing business with. And he was the reverend of a church, basically a big Baptist church in Harlem. But there was a really weird aspect of of Calvin Butts's church. The church owned a subsidiary called the Abyssinian Development Corporation, which had received over $500 million to buy real estate. So I thought that was a little interesting. Normally, when you think of churches, unless it's the Vatican, you don't really think of having $500 million real estate portfolios owned by churches with 60, 70 properties in the area.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so I thought, well, this is weird. So I looked into more about Calvin Butts and how he operates and how he got his wealth, how he went from being just kind of a regular broke dude to being basically worth $500 million as a preacher. And that sort of led me on a bit of a journey to understanding um, the relationship between big politics, big banks, big business, and big real estate. And it all sort of comes together in the Starbucks story. So if you remember, we started the story by talking about power. Philadelphians over, working towards empowerment and rebuilding. Right? Do you remember that was the name of the group that organized the Starbucks protests?
Yeah, the one
So,
who were yelling on the street who were saying, "We
yep,
can bend them. We can bend their
yeah,
will."
yes, we can force you to do what's best for you. Right, and you remember they were the ones who were issuing the list of demands, right, about
Yeah.
all the different political causes that Starbucks would need to pay money to. They were the ones that Starbucks met with in that behind closed doors meeting, right? That was sort of one of those weird things, like why are these masters of the universe meeting with this dinky group of church leaders in Philadelphia in response to this crisis? Well, this is the answer. The answer is that the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977 was basically instituted um, during the Carter administration as a way to uh, quell a lot of the race riots of the 1970s and the fact that a decade of affirmative action had not yet produced any changes in black ghettos and in basically like black parts of town or Hispanic parts of town, minority parts of town that eh, where the allegation was they really couldn't get on the escalator to wealth because they didn't own property. The property wasn't worth really anything to begin with, and someone had to jumpstart the cycle of getting investment into these uh, racial minority communities. And so the Community Investment Act of 1977 basically said that if you want regulatory approval for things like mergers or things like you know um, sorry, acquisitions, or if you want to open up branches in different parts of town, you need to have a rating of satisfactory or higher on your community reinvestment scorecard. Are you
Now,
following me so far?
just to understand this act, are you it's a federal act, but it essentially gives huge power to local city councils?
Yes. Huge power to local city councils and to the people who pressure them. The Saul Alinsky community organizing groups that we've talked about before, the ones who often, so what will happen is these. Remember, we talked about disparate impact law and how these community organize. You could basically sue a company for anything because everything creates a disparate impact, and disparate impact is illegal in housing and does this sound familiar? Do you remember from
Yeah.
I think it was so the majority of these suits and pressure was brought by organizations like Acorn, like Fight, like Power, like all of these. These groups were set up basically to shake down corporations for not for having disparate impact of their policies, and uh, the disparate impact doctrine applies to real estate, and it applies to community investment. So basically, from 1977 to 1994, the Community Investment Act existed, but it didn't have much teeth. In part, this was because it took a little bit of time for the regulators to get in place after 1977. And then from 1990, I'm sorry, from 1980 to 1992, we had Republican governance. That is, we had the 8 years of Ronald Reagan and then the 4 years of George Bush Sr. And the Community Reinvestment Act was not really enforced much by federal regulators. It didn't have much teeth. It had gums, but no teeth. But Bill Clinton is, as many people have described him, our first black president. He was the guy who. That's not my phrase.
I
That's
love it.
uh, he ran on a civil rights docket. He was the guy who played saxophone on Arsenio Hall in sunglasses at night.
Yeah.
He really built his political career on diversity politics, on being kind of a slick talking white guy who could own the racial minority vote. And one of the things that he did in 1994 was he radically increased the power of the Community Reinvestment Act, as well as created something that were called empowerment zones. So, empowerment zones were basically $100 million block grants to racial minority majority areas that you just got money basically for being poor, black, and in need of revitalization. And you
Hmm.
get these grants, $100 million at a time. And this coincided with the explosion of the phenomenon known as the CDC. The CDC is the Community Development Corporation, which is essentially the key, a corporation that gets shit tons of money from the federal or state grant makers, as well as often by private foundations, and is staffed by local community leaders. That is, church leaders, local political activists. You wonder what people with these political activism degrees do when they grow up, when they spend $200,000 buying them in college. This is what they do. They work for a local community organization or a CDC, a community development corporation, and they walk into hundreds of millions of dollars of funds that are there basically for political influence, to buy up local influence and receive federal funds that politicians are pressured into giving in order to buy the minority vote or the left wing white vote.
What could go
Um,
wrong?
what could go wrong? Well, actually,
All
I
good
had
intentions.
I really want to get to this. I was up and way too late one night researching this about
Sometimes
two
I
2 weeks.
wonder, how do you even survive? You spend so much time researching.
Well, it's
How old are
fascinating.
you? 80 years old?
Keeps me young, or it destroys my hairline. I mean, it's just this is it's what it is. It's like, what if a car crash lasted an entire lifetime? Would you ever
That's
keep
exactly how
driving?
it feels as you describe these economic structures. I'm like, oh god, it's painful.
Like, you can't take your eyes away from it. So this whole phenomenon of the real estate reverend that Robert Fitch talks about with respect to Obama's rise to power is that beginning in 1995, really, you started having these church leaders suddenly getting a shit ton of money, because that, in conjunction with another program called N, NTMC, I mean, the National Market Tax Credits, basically. Yeah, these are enormous. It's like, I don't know, like I think it's like $1.5 trillion in the past 15 years have gone into this program. Like, not even joking. It's like $1.5 trillion. And I have citations for all this if you want to get into it. And I will make sure that I post this at the end, by tomorrow
All
for the
right.
chat. Um, but basically, all of this was done in order to revitalize these areas And also, there was a lot of big money into it, a lot of money in it for these real estate developers who saw an opportunity to get this prized urban land that would go from being worth nothing to potentially being some of the most expensive real estate in the country, right? I mean, Center City Manhattan, for example, is that's very expensive, right? But imagine if you got it when it was imagine if you got, I don't know, Williamsburg, Brooklyn, which is like the most gentrified part of Brooklyn now, 10 years ago when it was, when there was, basically no white people. It goes from, especially if you have enormous plots of land there. All right. So let me continue with the story here. Beginning in 1995, a new business model opened with Bill Clinton for these church leaders and these community organizations, which had been in place now for about 30 years. The Saul Alinsky ones we talked about,
Hmm.
to not just shake people down for to get like racial discrimination lawsuits and disparate impact lawsuits and make their money that way, or through private foundations, but to start getting government money hand over fist. And these corporations double as being real estate developers and as being the corporate philanthropy diplomats for large corporate sponsors who could also pay them to ward off racial discrimination or disparate impact or hostile workplace environment lawsuits. So they became the corporate ambassadors. I don't know if you're following me so far, but this is where the commercialization aspect of it starts really revving up
So
for
we're talking
corporate
about the kind
philanthropy.
of people of the three pros that Starbucks has hired. Are we talking about that kind of people?
We're talking about two of them. We're talking. So one of them was Sherilyn Ifill was the NAACP. That shakedown has been going on for 100 years, or at least since the 1950s, 60s. But the two other ones, Byron Stevenson and Heather McGee, are community organizers. Basically, that's how they got their start. That's their main network. So um, we're going well beyond what most people think of when they think about diversity industry shakedowns. They think about Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton. This is much, much deeper than that. This is, but it is sort of getting to what they get paid to do. But we're going to take it in the specific example now of philanthropy. So um, in that case, they were getting paid as consultants. And I did want to get into the diversity industry consulting um, uh, industry, which I think maybe we'll do in a separate conversation, just because it's a little bit beyond the scope of it. It's very fascinating, um, but basically, these organizations, like the Abyssinian Development Corporation, that is these church leaders, are also the ones who are going to get paid by Starbucks because they do the steam control. The Abyssinian Development Corporation has contacts all up and down city, state, and even federal uh, politicians, like Calvin Butts, the guy who runs the Abyssinian Development Corporation, the real estate reverend, is very close friends with Rudy Giuliani, with George Pataki, the former New York governor. These are Republicans, and that's one of the reasons that Calvin Butts is often at odds with Al Sharpton and these other left wing black preachers who do these diversity shakedowns, is because the Republicans like Calvin Butts and the Abyssinian Development Corporation because they're the kind of black community leader that Republicans can work with. And also, um, they through a negotiation, the national market tax credit was extended not just to inner city black people, but also to urban white, I'm sorry, rural white jurisdictions as sort of pork barrel legislation to get Republicans on board. So there's an interesting aspect of it that transcends left wing and right wing here. But let's sort of get into the story of um, philanthropy. So I'll take a minute here to say that there's two different prongs that we're talking about. One of them is the reaction to the flashpoint of the two men getting arrested at Starbucks, which is when they hired all of the diversity industry bigwigs to do the training, to do the PR, to stop the lawsuits from flooding in. But the other aspect of it is Starbucks's 20-year history of paying these organizations to get a competitive advantage in in urban communities.
Yeah, because from
So
your earlier reports, I had the impression that Starbucks was new into this, but right now what you're telling us is the hiring of these three consultants was just one more move in a series of moves that has lasted for decades.
exactly right. Starbucks is not new. In fact, this is if you remember Starbucks, they have a huge history of things like this, right? I mean, if you remember, they had that Race Together campaign where, if you were going to buy coffee, then the barista had to have a conversation with you about race. Do you remember this? Does this sound familiar? I'll
Yeah,
pull up a link for you.
I'm cringing just remembering.
Yeah, so here's just a quick link to for that campaign and why it failed. But basically, you know, it was you go to buy your coffee. It's 7 a.m. It's Monday. Fuck, I hate Mondays. Oh my god, this work week is going to be so shitty. You go to buy your $4.50 coffee, and the barista berates you about your white privilege. And and what have you done for black people lately? And that was the that was the idea of it, but it was really, it was done because that was what their community partner board had voted for. See, they have a large national coalition of quote community partners, which are basically these local city council heads, these local church leaders, New York, LA, Chicago, Miami, all of these people are part of a large board, and you can look at it on their website.
I mean, you cannot
The
make these things up. Schulz himself acknowledges one of the biggest flaws in his initiative. People might find it hard to understand where his empathy comes from. I'm not black. I haven't lived a life in which I was racially profiled, and I wasn't discriminated against because of the color of my skin. It's the
yeah.
fantasy land of leftism and of privilege, and I've had people tell me I cannot speak about these issues because I haven't experienced what it is to not be a white man.
Right. Well, a lot of the pressure comes from below. And in fact, we're going to look at some of these Starbucks annual reports so that you can see where ideas like this come from and how they get support within the company to go ahead and announce this national campaign. Remember, they didn't do this quietly. They announced it weeks in advance, and it was this big initiative. And in part that's because they have this board. They have a policy board that is basically for their local community partners, their local real estate reverends, and diversity shakedown artists who vote in their diversity councils about what kind of new diversity initiatives to do. But anyway, Starbucks has been doing this for decades. That's how they came to own the inner city. Now, let's. Um, I want you to understand the genesis of this corporate mindset. So to do that, I'm going to first uh, introduce you to one of the most successful articles uh, ever published in the Harvard Business Review. The Harvard Business Review is it's basically the Harvard University uh, like business strategy journal. It is the go-to place for cutting edge corporate strategy. So I
Okay,
just sent
think
you a link
tank.
in the yeah, well, it's a journal. What they do is they publish case studies. They publish like the newest advances in theoretical corporate strategy. Okay,
All right.
so there's an article here by this article was written by Michael Porter. Michael Porter, if you don't know, I'm curious how many people in the chat know who Michael Porter is. Anyone who is a management consultant or business consultant or has gone to business school will know this name.
If you
because
know
this
Michael
is
Porter, press 1 on the chat. If you don't know Michael Porter, press 2. I will press 2 because I have no idea who that is.
okay. Cool. No, thanks. This is useful to see because I, I always wonder with this corporate stuff, like there's just so few people covering it, and I'm a corporate attorney, and I find this stuff endlessly fascinating. But it is how the world works. The world runs on business. Um, Michael Porter. Let's see, a lot of zeros and twos. All right. Um, I'm gonna. All right.
No one knows him.
Michael, no one knows. That's amazing. Michael Porter.
One
All right, we'll
guy.
look him up afterwards. Um, he is the godfather of corporate business strategy. He is the man who invented corporate strategy, basically. He uh, basically he came up with the whole concept of the value chain. How the supply chain works together with to create value. He basically created the modern concept of corporate value. Um, he is he is God of corporate strategy, and he released this article in 2001 that explained how corporations can use philanthropy to gain competitive advantage. And he notes a trend that was happening, beginning in the 1990s, uh, that he eventually saw as being the only way to do business in the future. And this article, I'm just going to read a few relevant sort of clips from it. Um, and I put this in the presentation as well. But he talks about how there are four traditional um, explanations for why companies might engage in philanthropy. In fact, I'll take a step back by talking about libertarianism and Milton Friedman. So, as I'm sure you're aware, as a libertarian, Milton Friedman, had that kind of Ayn Rand concept of what a business is uh, supposed organized to do, and that is to make money for its shareholders. Okay, so Porch Min in the comments here says Professor Porter is the most cited author in business and economics. That's correct. He is more than a guru. He is a godlike figure. When he speaks, the business world listens. And uh, philanthropy and business seems like a match made in hell, because the only seeming justification for corporations to engage in philanthropy is if it is somehow unseemly or corrupt, right? Because not only is the bedrock principle of a corporation that it's organized to maximize shareholder profit, but you actually have an affirmative obligation under the law. You have a duty of care, a statutory duty of care to maximize shareholder profit. And if you don't do that, you can actually be liable for shareholder class action lawsuits against the management of the company for engaging in actions that fail to maximize profit. So
Mm-hmm.
you have to ask yourself, just how does it maximize profit to pay off these church leaders and city council members in a way that is also, say, not hopelessly corrupt? So the article talks in the section here at the bottom of page 3. It talks about four prevailing justifications for CSR, corporate social responsibility, and one of these, they talk about a moral obligation, but that doesn't make money. Sustainability, but that doesn't make money. They talk about reputation, that counts, but there's one here that stands out: a license to operate. So the license to operate is very interesting. Basically, and now if you go to the middle of page 4, there's a sentence that starts: the notion of license to operate. I'll just read it out loud here.
Yep.
Derives from the fact that every company needs tacit or explicit permission from governments, communities, and numerous other stakeholders to do business. So basically, if you don't engage in enough philanthropy, you can have your corporate approvals yanked. You can't do business in that part of town. Now, um, so what Porter explores in this article is sort of this revolutionary new way. This is in 2001 or 2006 is when this article came out, but he describes for the decade before for companies to basically start paying local community leaders to basically start investing more and more in their local communities in order to ensure long-term operations, basically by solving concerns of local communities. The communities will start solving concerns that you have. Now, it's one thing if you're looking at this in the abstract, but when you marry this with racial identity politics, it starts to get extremely fucking nasty. Basically, the way it starts to operate is you have a black majority or Hispanic majority neighborhood that's a couple blocks away from extremely, extremely wealthy white neighborhoods and dirt cheap property prices, the chance to make an absolute killing if you could be a first mover in that neighborhood. And you have these black community leaders who say, all right, listen, you want to come in here, you need to start solving some of our problems. And some of our problems are money. Some of our problems are not enough black employment, say, not enough black business, business done with black, suppliers or black vendors or
That's
folks in the
exactly
neighborhood.
my
Or
problem, Frame Games. That's exactly everyone's problem. We
oh,
all
it's going
want
to get
money.
so ugly. I'm going to show you an example here. The one that kept me up until like I was supposed to meet. I was supposed to go out actually, and I just couldn't tear myself away from this. Um, well, maybe I'll do that next after I get through this article because what I want to tee up is this distinction that Porter talks about. This article, uh, and again, this is one of like the top 10 or 20 most like important articles in the HBR. It's like it's in their Hall of Fame, and it's the difference between reactive corporate philanthropy and strategic corporate philanthropy. And Porter's call to action here was listen, stop doing philanthropy when when you need something done or you got in trouble or there's a PR mess or something and your reputation is start seeing the people in your neighborhood as the high influencers in your neighborhood, the city council members, the mayor, the police department, the local and insurance regulators. Everybody start seeing them as stakeholders in your company and start doing favors for them so they'll do favors for you. So that is going to take us to there's I'm sorry, let me turn back to my turn back to my presentation here because there's a few things I wanted to get to. Uh, Actually, I think the first thing that I'll do is just to show you that I am not fucking with you. Here is a link to Starbucks's one of their like recent annual reports. Okay, copy link address, and here it is in the lobby. All right, so here on and here you'll see. I think this was their 2006 annual report, but it's in a bunch of them. I have a bunch of them like pulled up. But here, if you go to page 10 of Starbucks's annual report, that is, remember, annual report is what every public company has to publish, um, and as part of their annual 10K reporting obligations. Here in their social responsibility section, here they talk about their business case for why they give so much. This is in 2006. Why they pay so much money to local communities. And what do you know? Item number 5, just buried at the very, very end there. License to operate. At Star, let me look at this. Right, the heading is integrating our corporate social responsibility. At Starbucks, our commitment to good governance and ethical conduct and social responsibility is core to our way of doing business. Why do we do it? License to operate. Having a strong reputation as a socially responsible company makes it more likely we will be welcomed into a local community. what they're telling you, and I've got a million links, by the way, on like if you just Google like city council versus Starbucks or something, you'll see a million like local examples from like local newspapers of like local city councils doing battle with Starbucks and like not wanting them to come in. Then you'll see local op-eds like, oh my God, like we just let a Starbucks in. There goes the neighborhood. But what they do is they buy up the stakeholders. It's like Israel coming in and buying up your local congressman. Like Starbucks comes in, and these communities which hate gentrifiers, they don't even have a voice because their black leaders and their Hispanic leaders are bought up by these white and often Jewish, sort of, generally speaking, WASP or Jewish business leaders who come in and buy up the black and Hispanic community leaders, so that the actual people who are supposed to be electing their community leaders don't really have a choice in what goes on in their neighborhood. I don't know
Wow.
if this is starting to gel with some of our earlier things. I'm going to show you a case study now that I'll turn to, um, but let me first make sure that
I'll read
I've
some
gotten
super
through most.
chats while you do that.
Okay,
I will say the
great.
impression you give me, this is exactly why even someone who's business minded like me, I don't want to get involved into starting businesses because it's that kind of swamp you have to swim in. It's amazing that it happens, and it's amazing that it remains viable for Starbucks to be investing so much in social capital and still make profit out of its activities. As the News Network sends us $50. He says, Frame Games and JF, awesome as always. It's so good to be back on Monday because Jewish people cannot super chat to me on Saturday and Sunday. And so Alze's $50. I keep waiting for them during the week, and I try to go through the weekend without his big super chats. Mendelbrot says, all the best trilogies come in threes. TKUA says, you're welcome, Dainty. I think he's referring to our moderators who thank people who give money to the show. Thank you so much for the moderators to be adding this human aspect to our show, which is wonderful. Frederick White says, I am about 250 pages into Slaughter of Cities by E. Michael Jones. This is a must-read if you want to know how the FHA destroyed our country and drove us into the suburbs. Catholics were screwed. Alfonso Beltran
Yep.
says, JF, please do echo when saying Starbucks. I haven't reset my echo effect since Warski Live. I may do it in the future, but I don't have it available right now. And I'm changing computer. I'm currently building a i9 7900, one of the strongest computer possible to be built right now. I'm still waiting for some parts, but right now I've put the CPU in the motherboard, so I won't have an echo effect until I finish this work. Bia says, $10, thank you so much. He says, this is some good stuff, man, high quality. Thank you all for the super chats.
Okay, awesome. So you guys are going to love this part. All right. So one thing that I thought was really interesting in this Harvard Business Review article was talking about the situations when a company should be more or less aggressive about engaging in weaponized philanthropy. And here on page 6 of it, talks about the license to operate approach is the most. He says, by contrast to the other ones, is far more pragmatic. It offers a concrete way for a business to identify social issues that matter to its stakeholders and fosters constructive dialogue with regulators, the local citizenry, and political activists. One reason, perhaps, that it is especially prevalent among companies that depend on government consent, um, and those that rely on the forbearance of their neighbors. So I thought this was an interesting phrase, and it got me thinking about Silicon Valley and tech. And because it was a relatively recent thing, if you remember, that Google and Facebook became complete SJW overlords, right? They always had that liberal strain in them,
Yeah,
but it really wasn't until about 2014 when it was like suddenly it became it changed how you interacted on the platforms. Like, there was always a strain in it there, but then sometime around, they started giving shit. Google started, and Facebook actually, both of them gave shit tons of money to Black Lives Matter, to a number of other, like, explicitly racial groups, and it was kind of like, huh, well, that's weird. And they have not dialed that down, since then. So it got me thinking about Silicon Valley, and obviously, if you want to do business in like the local inner city or whatnot, you're going to see these kinds of disgusting sort of racial pay to play payoffs. So I started reading about the history of weaponized philanthropy in Silicon Valley, the history of giving, and I'm gonna give you an article now that does a fantastic job of describing it, and then we're going to follow a case study for everyone to see exactly how this works. So just give me one moment for my notes here. Um, Hold on a second.
Is it the Peter Hero Silicon Valley Giving?
Yes, there it is. Yep. And I just sent you the link here in the chat.
All right.
So this is an article. It says that it's from August 24, 2016, but it was actually, if you'll see at the bottom, this was actually initially published in November 27th, 2000. Okay. And in 2000, so this is right at the dawn of corporate philanthropy in Silicon Valley. It was the year 2000, and this article describes how this guy comes to town. He looks around and he sees these companies, and he says, "You know what? These fucking assholes are so tight-fisted. Unlike Coca-Cola, unlike Starbucks, unlike all these other big companies at the time, they don't give anything to charity." Um, they had this meritocratic, software developer mentality where you need to pick yourself up by the bootstraps. What you earn is what you deserve. And he talks about how he went about changing that by convincing Silicon Valley business leaders of the business case for philanthropy and how it could buy them things that would be often the most cost-effective way to improve their competitive position. A very interesting article, but one section really caught my mind because immediately I was thinking, Silicon Valley. You've got like Cupertino and Mountain View, but you're surrounded by like San Jose and like places that like bill themselves as like the heart of Silicon Valley, but they're really just kind of a place with a lot of racial minorities, but very little money. That doesn't really enjoy they're kind of like places that have a much harder time gentrifying and things like that. And there was a section here that caught my mind, caught my eye, and it is in the section about halfway down the article. You can run a search for the word Mayfair. And because I was immediately like, okay, what is the racial angle here? Because I know that the biggest business with these philanthropy things are always like giving money to racial groups for pay to play and so that you can buy, 30-40% of the vote wherever you go. So I started looking like, okay, what is the racial angle here? And here in the article, it says, nowhere will Hero's particular brand of community building be put to the test more than in the Mayfair neighborhood of East San Jose. It is there in a low-income, mostly Hispanic community of 6,500, the birthplace of farm worker organizer Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez is basically the Hispanic equivalent of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X rolled into one. If
Okay.
you're not familiar with sort of American racial history, Cesar Chavez is the Hispanic guy. He's the guy.
Okay.
And if you have any connection to him, it's like having a connection to Martin Luther King. This is one of Hero's high flyers, risky but with potential for big returns. In 1997, the Mayfair Improvement Initiative is aimed at permanently upgrading the prospects for an entire neighborhood, its streets, its homes, its schools, and its residents, projected to involve more than $15 million in public and private funding. That amount ended up going up, as we'll see, including $5 million from the Hewlett Foundation. The Hewlett Foundation is a basically left-wing SJW, like neo-colonialist foundation with absolutely hilarious links. But it
Okay.
involves a breathtaking array of 76 separate improvement projects, boosting literacy, adding streetlights, crossing guards. Right, it seems like just kind of a giant revitalization project, right? Like as a white person, you read that and you're like, okay, that sounds good. It sounds humanitarian, and it just so happens to be in a Hispanic neighborhood. A
Mm-hmm.
little weird for like Hewlett Packard and Microsoft to be involved in this sort of thing, but I'm sure there's a reason. So he talks about how the community foundation is serving as a general contractor, managing funds, finding donors for additional investment opportunities, including the proposed Cesar Chavez sports complex, $1.5 million dollars for real estate developers there, overseeing it all. Hero sees Mayfair as a flagship project, a microcosm of what we're about. Uh, the list of projects and goals was developed by the neighborhood, not handed down. You're going to see how the sausage is made there, because that is a really funny joke, that sentence. But all right, everything is aimed at building connections between Hispanic and Vietnamese neighbors. Well, not really, between these corporations and these constituents, with public agencies and with corporate job. It's funny, it's all sandwiched in between there. You can delete about 2/3 of that sentence, and what you end up with is everything is aimed at building connections with public agencies. So let so I'll read one more paragraph in this before I we go on the journey of this, because I read all of the annual reports for this entire project. I was fascinated with it. It is a story of untold corruption, and there's a reason you won't see any follow up uh, in Fortune magazine about this particular case study. Uh, but anyway, says upgrading a neighborhood is not easy. An improvement in residents' economic prospects will encourage many to move out unless Mayfair becomes a more attractive neighborhood. And simply making neighborhood improvements without increasing household income will invite gentrification.
Hmm.
So keep that in mind. You have these huge Silicon Valley companies who are setting up a private foundation. You don't hear anything about, like you hear a little bit about public money here when they talk about it, but not much. And so this is creating the impression of what most people think of with like the Starbucks style corporate philanthropy. Like they go in and they're just improving the neighborhood. Well, what if I told you that the purpose of this was to buy off all of the major San Jose city council members, state assembly members, to get all of the biggest political influencers well fed and paid, and then gentrify a neighborhood to make the property that you own in the neighborhood rise in value, as well as to create as well as to bring more talent uh, into the Silicon Valley area by gentrifying it, and thereby sort of expanding like the size of Silicon Valley relative to these Hispanic natives who are so proud of their mostly Hispanic neighborhood. Now, if I told you that second part, you'd probably say, "Well, that actually sounds like a pretty good deal, for Silicon Valley. They would probably get a lot out of that." But I don't really see much in it for the Hispanic, uh, folks. So why did they get on board with it? So here is what happened to the Mayfair Improvement Initiative. I'm just going to pull up my list of links here. Just give
So
me
the
one
text that we
second.
were consulting on Fortune, that's from 2016. So it's relatively recent, right?
No, no. If you scroll to the bottom, you'll see it's from 2000. It was
Okay,
reprinted in 2000.
2000.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so here is what happened. Give me one second. So hold on a second. The first thing, I started looking into this. So I started just Googling like, San Jose Mayfair Initiative, and I'm just going to send you a list of links, and then I'll show you, um, what ended up happening. I'm just putting them in the lobby here for you. So maybe we can start with the last link that I just sent you. That is the original plan between San Jose. You'll notice it's sanjose.gov.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the initial plan between it's the Mayfair Neighborhood Improvement Project. It's the plan between three groups of stakeholders. You've got the philanthropists, the corporate philanthropists. You've got the city, represented by city council, the mayor, and then you've got the local leaders. Those include the real estate reverends, if you will. That's not such a big thing in Hispanic communities, but the community leaders, the ones who run these groups like Power in Philadelphia. Now, if you remember, Power is a local subsidiary of, remember, they're a chapter of a much bigger network that we talked about, the Pico network, which is also in California and is related to a lot of the groups we'll be meeting in this section of the talk. So here is the plan for all of this money to go into Mayfair. So it starts with talking about the vision and these community organizations such as the Mayfair Improvement Initiative. That's the group that that's set up by the local community. That becomes basically a CDC, a community development corporation. The Mexican American Cultural Services Association, MAXA, and we'll be talking about MAXA a bit here more. The San Jose Grail Resources Center, Mayfair Park, all these other constituents, right? They're all sort of coming together to talk about this. And they go over the list of goals, and most of them just seem relatively humanitarian. But then there are some really weird things that keep coming up. Like, for example, on page 31 in the plan concepts, all of the potential sites involve doing it at the places where these political activism groups, such as MAXA, are located. And it also requires political support. That is, it requires. So if you turn to page 33, for example, it's a little weird that these corporations are, as part of this negotiation with the city and the city leaders, have to support immigrant rights, including a resolution for Mexican for Hispanic people from Mexico to be able to use their Mexican ID cards rather than U.S. photo ID cards, right? Like, these are really weird ethnic advocacy, strictly political concepts, right? Like, this isn't like, repairing street lamps. It's like, wait a second, you're just arguing for more illegal immigration and to against e-verify and other kinds of and other forms of just good American politics. You're making this racial.
But
Are
it
you with me
sounds
so far?
humanitarian. It also sounds humanitarian there. It seems like concerns that leftists have, that illegal migrants not be treated bad, and that we adjust to illegal or legal migrants wanting to use various papers as part of their identification.
Sure, fair enough, and I certainly grant that. So I think it's important then to show what actually happens. So remember, even as identified by the article early on, um, there was resistance because of gentrification, because of concerns that these big money people were coming in really for gentrification, to kick them out and destroy their Hispanic community more than to actually improve their lot. Right? That was like a big part of what they were afraid of. So here in this link, so what ends up happening here in this link? This is a annual report that the charity published called Lessons from the Middle. And in this report, they talk about what ended up, sort of, the status of the project. In fact, maybe just to make sure that we are end up on time. This report basically talks about problems that they ran into and what worked and what didn't work. And what I thought was really interesting about it is, um, it it wasn't happily written. Like, the
No.
report seems to
Most
talk
of us had
about
no idea what would happen in the coming years. It wasn't
yes.
easy and there were numerous bumps in the road. That's why the Community Foundation decided to put together this toolkit. It looks like the last tips of a dying person to people who remain alive. And here's what I learned from life, people.
It is. This fascinated me because I've read a million of these things, right? I mean, anytime you don't publish a corporate like piece like this without putting without a victory parade, without declaring victory somewhere. And one of the things that I kept seeing in this report was like 7 years, 7 years. Like people wanted to pull out beforehand. So like the community wanted us to keep putting in more money after 7 years. Like a lot of the sponsors wanted to drop out because of all the problems. Um, but we had to stay in there for 7 years. Like we had to convince them to stay in for seven. And I thought that was so weird. Like what is with this 7 year thing? So then independently, I was looking at the Abyssinian Development Corporation in New York and how how that reverend made the $500 million. And it turns out that the NTMS, I'm sorry, the National Tax Market Credit Program requires exactly 7 years of investment into an area in order to basically get a shit ton of money in public grants for the 7 year period. So basically, like they are you don't hear about this here or anywhere else in their materials, but there's a whole cottage industry for basically getting rich off of national tax market credits, and this was part of it. I mean, they got a shit ton of money from the NTMM MS. And I don't want to be right, go on that point too much because we have a lot more to cover. But let me show you like what ended up happening with this. First, I thought it was really interesting. I was like, well, what ended up happening with like MASCA, the Mexican American, Socio-Cultural Association? So I go to MASCA's website and I notice none of the links work. I'm like, okay, well, that's maybe like a lot of these sort of community organizations, they've just don't dedicate a lot to online.
Hmm.
So then I look at well, who actually received the money from the Silicon Valley execs, and I at Masca, and lo and behold, it was a guy named Javier Campos. Now, Javier Campos was the COO, Chief Operating Officer of Maxa, uh, and at first I was like, okay, well, who is this guy? I'm sure there's an angle here. There always is. And lo and behold, his sister Nora Campos is basically the second highest at the time, was like the second highest ranking state assemblyman in the state of California, and she won her district with like 75% of the vote because she marched with Cesar Chavez. And so you have these Silicon Valley companies basically getting paid with public funds to give that money to like some of the biggest political influencers in the state of California to 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 buy and develop real estate in Hispanic communities. And a little I guess story on Javier Campos is pretty fascinating what ended up happening to him. So I'll send you some links here. Javier Campos, the chief community leader that this philanthropy money went to, ended up narrowly evading jail about half a dozen times because the funds all disappeared. It was
Hmm.
supposed to. So here you go. I will the link that I just sent you. Shows how basically a bunch of people in Maxa were jailed for basically not they had all this money that they received that a big portion of it went into like the pension funds for Maxa, and then the one day the employees turn around and find that there's no money in the in the pension funds, and the management had just ran away with it. And there's a number of articles chronicling this. Basically, the whole thing was a corrupt front that none of the money actually went into revitalizing the community. Most of the people went to jail, except the head of it, who was the guy whose influence they bought, who then went on to become the head of city council in San Jose.
Hmm.
Uh, and and I mean, but this is a guy who now, and they passed a number of like, they passed a bunch of legislation that was like applauded by these guys, and there was a really interesting thing ended up happening um, to the Mayfair initiative that they set up, because I kept searching for the Mayfair initiative, and it turns out that the Mayfair Investment Initiative ended up getting so disgusted with these people, these philanthropists, that they end up changing the name to Somos Mayfair. Somos being a Hispanic word for, I forget right now. I have it in my notes, but basically they thought that the Mayfair Investment Initiative was like too colonial sounding, too English sounding, and they reconstituted themselves as a community organization that is dedicated in part to stamping out gentrification. So like they went on to be like, because when you look at what actually ended up happening with all this money, is it had the effect of gentrifying huge parts of San Jose, or like the surrounding neighborhoods around Mayfair, not making the neighborhood richer, and having the community actually revolt against these philanthropists and taking the money and actually becoming an anti-gentrification activism fund. Um,
So essentially, a bunch of true activists within this organization were not happy with what happened, and they've became anti proponents of it. They've become
yes,
an obstacle to gentrification.
yes. So it's really interesting what ended up happening to the players in this. So Javier Campos basically, evades jail several times. Finally, he's caught up in so many corruption scandals that he has to leave office. So he ends up getting, he ends up, I think, losing an election and then becoming like a big political pariah. And then he is hired by his sister's PR firm, essentially, PR and lobbying firm. It is a Hispanic political advocacy organization, um, that ends up going through a number of iterations. And essentially, what you do if you work there is you get paid um, to lobby for Hispanic issues in the California State Congress. And I can walk through all the links for this if you're interested in gruesome detail. But he ends up becoming a political lobbyist for like racial Hispanic issues, and the organizations themselves are hilarious.
It's
I'll
like the
show you a
end of
link.
Thank You for Smoking. The guy ends up being a consultant for others to
Oh,
replicate what he's done for the cigarette industry.
yes. No, it's actually exactly like that. And what's really interesting is these ha- these companies stay in business in part. In fact, maybe I'll show you one in particular. Because last time we talked about the supplier diversity supplier industry, right? The diversity supplier programs and how much money's pumped into that. And remember how you get certified for being a minority owned business? Do you remember that section we talked about? Like
Yeah.
where, to
You
be a
have to have
minority
a
owned business,
certain percentage of your board, but it doesn't have to be control. It can be a
it doesn't have to be
percentage, but
economic rights.
yeah.
And not only that, they have these, it's not super easy because unlike the way diversity politics works uh, outside of the business context, where your race is what you self-identify, outside of the Rachel Dolezal cases, there is a racial tribunal that determines whether or not you are Black or Hispanic or white when you go to apply for minority business. Um, when you go to apply for minority business certification. So I don't know if you remember that, but one of the things we covered is that not only do you have to do written essays and like phone interviews, but you also have to do. There's also on-site visits so that they can meet with you in person uh, and determine basically how Hispanic or Black you are. And so I was really curious when I was following Javier Campos and his rise and fall after receiving all of this philanthropy money. And he landed at Vole Strategic Advisors, which is this political lobbying and diversity management group. And here I'll send you a link in the. I was looking in the lobby.
I'm looking at the
Uh,
part of your presentation where there's this girl, and it's like, is she Hispanic enough to receive diversity dollars?
well, let me tell you a little bit. Are you familiar with what's happened in Brazil since 2014 with
No.
their racial tribunals? Okay, well, we're gonna take a little detour for this because I think this will change you forever, JF. This is remember
At this point, I
Brazil
think
is
you
the
totally wasted me, frame games. I think that I cannot. You've made me reach the bottom of the barrel. I cannot be more
okay.
depressed than this.
We have to go over this. This is an article in Foreign Policy about uh, what Brazil affirmative action programs are like in Brazil now. So if you remember, Brazil is the template for like Canada and the US, right? It is like the Brazilification of all race is like the desired end result, right? We're all beige, we're all like there's no white majority. Um, and Brazil has recently gone completely over the deep end with their affirmative action stuff. Um, they came to the affirmative action game late. They came in 2001. Remember, we came basically in the 1950s and 60s, but they came hard, so to speak, like late, but like in 2001 is when they started affirmative action, and in 2014 they passed the law of social quotas, which has mandatory set asides in all public sector positions that 20% of all positions have to be for non-white minorities.
I mean, I'm a
Um,
geneticist. I have a doctorate in evolutionary biology. And if you ask me to start qualifying Brazilians, I wouldn't even be sure if I could point to what's a minority in Brazil. It's the most race mixed part of America.
Right. Well, this exactly goes to show actually what is going to happen with these diversity industry programs in the future. Because so I'm going to just direct you to some of the more shocking parts of this article. Hold on, I have it all highlighted on my screen, so mm, I'm just going to bring this here. Hold on one second. Um, okay, so we'll start with the fifth paragraph down. This article is ostensibly about like 25 people who got kicked out of a med school in Brazil because they weren't Black,
Okay.
and it talks about sort of the evolution of this. So here in the fifth paragraph down, they say the Ethnicity Evaluation Committee, of which one of the protagonists is a member, was installed to address the loophole of people claiming to be like Black or Hispanic when they weren't. And we here they talk about we saw the most incredible situations unfold. People would shave their heads, wear beanies, get a tan, just a series of strategies to turn themselves Black. Including darkening features with makeup, the stuff we all associated with that big Rachel Dolezal stuff is happening en masse in Brazil because of how extensive the diversity industry is, right?
My God.
20% of every institution. Okay, now here's the thing. It's not because of of demographics as destiny sort of thing. Brazil is very racially stratified in terms of success. 80% of the top 1% in Brazil are white, even though it is a hugely non white country. It is what a lot of diversity advocates refer to as colorism or color stratification, the sort of more phenotypically white you are, and in those different stratifications are very precise measurements for your socioeconomic status statistically. So here they go into how the ethnicity evaluation committee works. And now going back further down the article, 11 experts comprise the panel. Among them, basically, these affirmative action administrators, anthropologists, and leaders in the wider Black community of the local area. They receive strict guidelines from the public prosecutor's office, that is, law enforcement. Phenotypical characteristics are what should be taken into account. Arguments concerning the race of one's ancestors are therefore irrelevant.
Oh my
Okay,
god.
are you
It's
getting this? So
racism
even
without race.
you're gonna die at this next part because here's
Because
the punchline. Okay,
even before you read that sentence, I was about to tell you, don't they want a geneticist on this committee? That might help resolve some stuff, but no, they don't
no,
want it.
it doesn't even matter if your parents are Black. All it matters is, do you look Black and are you politically Black?
Wow.
Now, so watch this. Okay. All right. So the official criteria for phenotypic characteristics, even if both of your parents, if you had a Black mom, right? Um, so here's what the Department of Education, the from the blackest state in Brazil, decreed with their checklist, which was leaked to the press. Among the criteria is the job candidate's nose short, wide, and flat? How thick are the lips? Are the gums sufficiently purple? What about their lower jaw? Does it protrude forward? Candidates were to be awarded points per item based on hair type and skull shape. This is from the Department of Education from the blackest state in Brazil.
I mean, you could write a comedy movie and put just that. Just it would be a straight joke in a Hollywood movie, mainstream movie, but it's reality in Brazil.
JF, they're asking for it. They're demanding checklists for nose size and lip thickness and jaw protrusion.
I
Do
mean,
you
this
get
is
like
more racist than everything I've ever done in my entire life.
they're asking for it? They are.
The nose short, wide, or flat. The thickness of the lips, and the gums being sufficiently purple. What about my gums? Are they
So this
sufficiently
is
pink? My
welcome.
god.
So welcome to the minority certification status test of the future. Because remember, they're already doing. They're not, for the NMSDC. You don't. You know, it's a lengthy process. Like you don't just send in a picture. Like they meet with you on site. They do interviews. So this is also part of the test, right? So if you scroll down to the bottom, um, the second to last paragraph, he says, for the time being, individual students will be obligated to navigate the country's evolving racial codes on their own. Um, one person remembers his interview with the evaluation committee lasting 8 minutes, and they started by asking, basically how involved he was with the Black activist movement. And this guy's saying, I shouldn't have to be an activist to be considered Black, right? Like this is a guy who had he had like a Black dad, and he was turned down in the affirmative action programs for not being Black enough. So, anyway,
Sargon would have
so
no chance in Brazil. Sargon of Akkad with his great grandfather being black. Forget it, Sargon.
oh yeah,
You don't
yeah,
have the
but
gums, you
increasingly
don't
here.
have the nose.
But have a look into right. Brazil is the future. Brazilification. I mean, this is what it's moving to, and why? Because this is what happens when you create an industry. When you create an industry, you create massive incentives to get the money, and then massive protectionist efforts to protect that money to keep it so that there is the bare minimum number of of hands who are taking pieces of the pie.
Mm-hmm.
And even if that interferes with principles, at a certain point, the industry achieves enough power on its own that it can become a power player. And that is what has happened. This is one of the reasons that I think the diversity industry series is so important, is because people need to understand the vastness of this, as well as what the state of international business is. Remember, every one of there is racial certification for all of these things now in the US, for federal contracts, for the NMSDC, for all this stuff. Now, they might not be as explicit about jaw size and nose size yet, but don't be surprised if stuff like that starts getting floated. There is precedent for it, and it is and as these things get bigger and bigger in terms of the amount of money and the amount of power that's incumbent to them, you will start to see more and more of an evolution in the space. So I thought it was really interesting when I was following Javier Campos's post philanthropy life, and I noticed that he ended up at Volet Strategic Advisors, which, when you go to their website, which I'll show you here, um, looks like it kind of looks like any corporate website, right? You've got general corporate platitudes that say nothing at all, like make your vision a reality.
Featured
And
services. I mean, this is an already made model website. They just filled in the text, basically.
yeah, no, that's true. That's true. Well, here, actually, let me pull up a link here, and I just posted this on. I just created a private like a private like channel. Does this YouTube link that I just sent you work?
Yep. All right, you want me to
So
play the video now?
yeah, sure. If you started around 20 seconds, this is Volet. This is the place that he landed at, the basically Hispanic politics money funnel, which is basically like, if you want to buy off, if you want access to the to the local city councils, or if you want access to who's the big guy they're connected to now, Kevin DeLeon, and all the other like Hispanic like state legislators. Like, you go through these organizations like this. But I came across this video that they published on their social media, and if you just play it from like, I guess from about 20 seconds to or about maybe like 10 seconds to like 40 seconds,
All right,
this
I'll
thing
play
stuck
it.
out to me.
At 20 seconds, I'm starting it now.
Yeah, just like
There's a
20 to
lot
40.
to learn for us as an organization, and we've been working for this moment. As you may have remembered, we have gotten our certifications as being a minority-owned business, a woman-owned business, and now this is an important next step in our growth and development. I want to thank all of our clients and all of our friends and supporters for being with us along the way. We look forward
So
to
I looked at that and I
investing what we
thought,
learned back
that's
into
just
the
really
company.
funny, because she's really proud of it. So like, I went to their Facebook page, and I saw, they made this big post when they got the certification for being a minority owned business. And the whole thing is just like, all these people like, congratulations, that's amazing. Congratulations, we're so happy for you. And it's like, wait a second. You didn't do anything. You literally didn't do anything. You got
Well,
certified as being what you were born as.
yeah,
Um, but the
she's
reason
being
it's
a
deserving
woman,
of
and she's being
yeah,
Hispanic.
congratulations, right? So, but the thing is, this buys them entry to the entire universe of big money for big diversity. So for example, if you go back to their website and you look at their featured services, so one of the things that they do is crisis management. And it's really interesting. They have all these videos on like, we're available 24/7 in case there's a racial discrimination or hostile workplace environment, like involving like Hispanic relations. We're up all hours of the night to make sure that we're on top of like commanding the media narrative. And like, we have contacts all over Spanish speaking media, from Mexico to Venezuela to Brazil, like you name a Latin country, we have TV contacts there like 24/7. And it's like, dude, this is the service. Like this is and of course, like you click on it, and what is another one of their selling points? Of course, at the bottom of every page of the website, Volet Strategic Advisors is certified as a woman and minority owned company by the National Minority Supplier Development Council and the state of California. We recognize the commitment to supplier diversity that is embraced by government, by corporations and political agencies, and we can add diversity to your supply chain. So this last part is
Supply
what
chain, I love it.
Well, because remember, if you want a government contract, if you want to participate in the $500 billion federal contract, economy, and the enormous state contract economy, and if you want, I can play you some clips of that we didn't get to last time. You need to have a certain proportion of your supply chain be minority-owned business. So
if you hire them, that's already one.
Yep. So this set off fireworks in my head when I was looking at this, because that is exactly in. Okay, so let's talk about the finance. How are we doing on time? How are we doing on energy? How are you
we
feeling?
have plenty of time. I have an interview at midnight with Dave Martel, so we have plenty of time. If you have more stuff to show, it's pretty fascinating.
All right, chat. Hit one if you're enjoying this. Smash that like button. Show some love.
All right, show some love, and Frame Games will keep bringing us these absolutely crushing informations.
So what really fascinated me about this is that I started looking into a bunch of these other, certified minority-owned businesses things, and they always have it as that selling point. We can add diversity to your supply chain. You can get diversity supplier program credit for, if you hire us. And that reminded me of something that first jolted me out of, my libertarian dogma, which was the 2008 financial crisis. At the time, I was very involved in libertarian politics, and I saw it as like the only way. And I remember reading Steve Saylor's series on the minority mortgage meltdown, and a fascinating economy had emerged with respect to the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977. And do you want to segue into that now? Because I think you're gonna like this part.
Now I'm being told that Halsey has a debate at 10 p.m. So it would be great to close within the next 50 minutes so that we can send our crowd to Halsey.
Great. Okay. So that sounds good. I can do that. This will be like the last topic for this, and then I'll just kind of do like a quick wrap up on how it relates to Starbucks to close it out. But we can talk about all these. These are all concepts that apply to everything, which is why I thought Starbucks was such a fascinating flashpoint, because every one of these things are sort of tied up in Starbucks' evolutionary history and why it reacted the way it did. So a fascinating thing happened on the way to the 2008 financial crisis. Where last we left off, we were in 1995, and the Clinton administration had just passed the empowerment zones, and it had revitalized the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act, the long dormant act of 1977, by requiring scorecards be issued for all banks for all financiers in urban areas. And what happened with that was taking off. Like the early seeds of that were starting in the late 90s, and the requirement that you have a satisfactory or higher rating, because the new czars in charge at the federal level were all friends of Bill Clinton, and what is now sort of commonly called the developer Democrat complex. That is the complex of money that goes into Democrat politics, left-wing politics, from large real estate developers, like and sort of urban housing and things like that. So once Clinton's czars become in charge, the scorecards start getting rolled out, and people need to start complying with the Community Reinvestment Act, which means they need to start getting credits, CRA credits. You get credits by making loans to racial minorities, or by hiring people that do work basically on behalf of those communities. Like maybe those, you might say hire a consulting company that helps get your numbers right, or that does microfinance, or maybe it's a Black-owned business, and the brother is on the local community board or something. That was initially how CRA compliance got started. It was with credits. If you wanted to qualify, if you wanted to have a satisfactory rating, there became a sudden market need for a particular type of product. And that product was racial minority owned shit. Anything of any kind. Because if it was whatever it was, you could chalk it up to community investment. And even if that meant initially early on, like your janitors are done through like a Black-owned business process. In fact, there's a link. Maybe I can show you now on that. It's a funny link from the state of Massachusetts in terms of how to qualify for if you want a state contract. Like, let's just say you want money from Parks and Recreation. You want money to help the local squirrel population in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you need to make sure that you hit your minority targets, your minority representation, your minority community reinvestment targets. So, hold on a second. I'm trying to pull up the link here, but maybe I'll hold off on that for now.
Are you
So
telling
what
me
happened
that
is
they were explaining you should hire a black janitor company to make
what it
your
says
credits?
is this. Yeah, hold on. I do want to get you the specific link. It's just that I might need to pull this up in a different browser, but I'll get it to you eventually here. But what they talk about is, there's a certain section on the application for your Plant a Tree Foundation, where you need to pick a target for how much investment into like minority institutions you're going to make that year, and like how much of like the grant money is going to help that. And they talk about it, and like basically they say you should target 15%, and like your goals and milestones for how you're going to get there. So a very similar thing happened with the CRA, with the Community Reinvestment Act. You needed to get your numbers right, but it wasn't so bad at first because there was this tech bubble and everything was really rich in the late 1990s. But it all came crashing down in 1998, 1999 with the famous tech bubble. And if you remember, there was the famous Paul Krugman New York Times article where this is in the early 2000s, and if you remember, Paul Krugman at the time was the most famous economist in the world. Like, he was at the height of his power at that time, Nobel Prize winning economist, and columnist for the New York Times. And he wrote that the only way to get out of the tech bubble would be to inflate a real estate bubble. And this became, I'm not, you can actually Google this, just Paul Krugman tech bubble, real estate bubble. I'll see if I can pull you the exact quote. Yeah, he said, this is in 2002, right at the sort of beginning of this. He said, Alan Greenspan needs to create a housing bubble to replace the dot-com bubble. And that is exactly what happened. George Bush, through a speech that Steve Saylor actually covers magnificently in his Minority Mortgage Meltdown series. He does this speech, I think it was in 2004, where he announced, maybe it was before then, but he announced the Minority Home Ownership Initiative, which was, I think, important for everyone to know about because it set the stage for Trump. If you remember, one of the defining uh, dynamics of neocon politics is completely cucking on demographics and trying to buy the Hispanic vote because
Mm-hmm.
Mexican immigration was going to be, Mexicans were going to be the new majority, or at least the new sort of plurality. And so, there was a big fight beginning in the 1990s uh, for the soul of the Hispanic voter. And there was the famous sort of Bush quotes that that Hispanics are natural conservatives, and that has left an indelible mark on the Republican Party, really since a little bit before Bush, but certainly it was Bush is what escalated it in an enormous way because. I mean, even to this day, right? Who were the principal people running against Trump? Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, and Jeb Bush. I mean, these were like the top contenders for the most part were either Hispanic or married to an extremely extreme political advocates for Hispanic issues. That's why amnesty was, a foregone conclusion. It's why the wall or immigration control was never talked about. It
Mm-hmm.
was because ever since Pat Buchanan was ran out of the Republican Party, in like 1996 to 98. The answer was we're going to get rid of the Pat Buchanan sort of white identity, right, once and for good, and we are fully on board this Hispanic, buy-in thing. And they did get the numbers up pretty high. I think they were, in the 30 percentage something during the Bush years, and I forget what they were recently. But this was in large part due to the enormous bending over backwards of George Bush. So let me pull up this speech. So just so you can understand the context here. All right. Here was the speech. And you don't necessarily need to play it if you don't want to. But remember, this is a right-wing conservative president who says this is in 2002, the same year as the Krugman article, and shortly before the minority mortgage meltdown went nuclear, or I'm sorry, during the lead up to that, he says there's a ownership gap in American society. More and more people own homes, but we have a problem because fewer than half of Hispanics and half of African Americans own homes. We have to work together to knock down the barriers that have created a home ownership gap. It's an ambitious goal. It's one I believe we can achieve. And by the end of this decade, we'll increase the number of minority homeowners by at least 5.5 million families. That's not people, that's families. If the average household is in those populations is like, I don't know, maybe three. I know that African Americans on average have about 4 children, and I'm not sure about Hispanics, but it's this is you're talking about an enormous amount of home ownership increase.
Did it happen?
Well, it did,
It did.
and then it destroyed everything. It did because the story of the subprime loan is the story of the minority loan, and we'll get to that. That's what we'll sort of dedicate the rest of the time here to, I guess, because the Starbucks has a lot of analogies to this, because literally what happened was it was like they bought off all of the regulators, they bought off all of the Black and Hispanic community leaders. At the end of the day, it actually ended up being the thing that caused them to go bankrupt and lose their homes. Like, so the end result of both Starbucks and the financial crisis is that these Black and Hispanic people are losing their homes to these sort of capitalist neo-colonialists who are all doing it in the name of diversity.
Mm-hmm.
So here you go. This is 2002, George Bush's speech. To open up the doors of home ownership, there are some barriers, and I want to talk about 4 that need to be overcome. First, down payments. Now, for those of you hearing this for the first time, who heard that the 2008 financial crisis was because of banker greed, well, that's part of it, but for very different reasons than you heard. This might make your stomach turn. Here is the Republican conservatives president's war on down payments. That is a 10 or 20% down payment on the home, something that you always have made to date, pretty much in the entire history of American real estate, to show that you actually have some skin in the game and won't abandon the mortgage, to show that you already have a certain amount of savings and income that you can afford 10 to 20% of the price of the house going into it.
This is one of the difference between a mortgage and a mortgage that kind of plays a role in your life as a kind of rent that you're taking a risk on. Because if people don't have skin in the game from the beginning, they can see their mortgage payment as a rent payment.
Yeah. Certainly the mortgage payment, but the down payment is like a security deposit.
Yeah.
Except it goes towards equity. So this is George Bush declaring war on down payments. A lot of folks can't make a down payment. They may be qualified. They may desire to buy a home, but they don't have the money to make a down payment. Basically he goes on to suggest that banks and home lenders abandon down payment requirements on mortgage applications. And I'll take you through the history of how that actually played out. Spoiler alert, they dropped it so that they could meet their CRA accreditation. Another obstacle to minority home ownership is the lack of information. And this created a huge burst in the affirmative marketing. Remember, we talked about that last time. That's affirmative action in marketing. Remember, you can get sued if you don't have enough black people, if you're in a black neighborhood, or enough Hispanic people if you're in a Hispanic neighborhood. Well, guess what? That's part of your CRA test. Your Community Reinvestment Act test is how much affirmative marketing you've done, and that's designed to solve the information problem. Okay. 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 So here is a success metric. Well, I'll get to more on that in a second. But to answer your question, this is in George Bush's memoirs. His 2010 memoirs. He brags by saying, at the height of the housing boom, home ownership high had hit almost 70%. That's pretty fucking incredible, actually. 70% home ownership. I had supported policies to expand home ownership, including down payment assistance for low-income and first-time buyers, which is really a proxy for the racial element to buy the Hispanic vote and compete for minorities, which we'll get to. Together, the global pool of cash, easy monetary policy, booming housing market, insatiable appetite, and leverage create a house of cards. That's his explanation for it. But we'll turn now to who these champions of diversity really are. The superstar. If you ask most historians today about who was the lead villain of the 2008 financial crisis, they will tell you it was a man named Angelo Mozillo. Angelo Mozillo was the head of Countrywide Financial, which was the sort of largest. I'm trying to find you a video now that I downloaded, but I haven't uploaded yet. So I may actually just quickly upload it while we're talking, since it'll only take a second here. But it goes to show you Angelo Mozillo. Oh, in fact, I have a speech that's perfect for this. Angelo Mozillo is the man who's most credited in the mainstream media telling of for the disaster of the financial crisis, because his was the most. He got the richest off of it the fastest and crashed the hardest. He ran Countrywide Financial, which went bankrupt and I think was bought up by Bank of America. And 1 second, trying to find the link here. He gave a speech in 2004 where he talks about being at the forefront of racial diversity lending and how he has been the most aggressive and creative of for dropping all lending standards to equalize home ownership between blacks and whites. And basically, here's an interesting one. This is from 2003, before the meltdown, and here is a loving report of back when Angelo Mozillo was the toast of the town, and including him sort of yucking it up with George Bush here. If you want to play like a minute or two of this, so that you can get a sense of Angelo Mozillo before we go on with it.
All right, I'm playing now.
Distinguished leader Angelo Mozillo has spent a lifetime making the dream of home ownership possible for millions of Americans. While pursuing this mission, Angelo built one of America's most successful financial enterprises, Countrywide Financial Corporation, headquartered in Calabasas. Angelo, now chairman, president, and CEO of this Fortune 500 company, made his entire business a reflection of his personal values.
Any company, particularly one as fortunate as Countrywide, has a responsibility to serve the community. In fact, I think that should be their first priority.
Angelo inherited the strong sense of community from his family. Named for his paternal grandfather who came from Naples, he was raised in a traditional Italian home. He learned the principles which would make him a leader from his mother, Pauline, and father, Ralph.
I grew up in the Bronx, very difficult, very challenging. Fortunately, we had a very strong family. And my mother was is a very hard-driving individual. High expectations for both herself and her children. My dad was a very hard-working butcher in a small butcher shop in the Bronx.
All right, so his dad was a butcher. He's from the Bronx, and they were from Naples, Italy, and he's a self-made man, essentially.
Yeah, so he didn't do nothing.
So, is he rich, or well, did he crash?
Oh, he only made $385 million off of this. And it's okay. So maybe I'll cut a little bit more to the chase. I'm trying to find the exact speech because it's so prophetic. He makes it in 2004, and he's bragging about how they've ended down payments. They've ended like basically everything but credit scores. Like they've ended all soft data. Like, and by the way, because of the Community Reinvestment Act, everybody abandoned soft data analysis of loans because any amount of discretion, since there was always going to be disparate impact. Do you understand? Like, no matter how you jimmied the numbers, there was always
no
going to be
matter
disparate
what
impact.
you were going to process, even if it was a zip code, ultimately not everyone in the zip code would be of equal racial. There would not, you would have zip codes with a certain racial diversities, other zip code with other races. So no matter what you discriminate on, that would give you an answer to whether that person can be trusted with a loan was discriminatory in nature.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's one way to put it. What the point I was making, sort of more precisely, was that since there was always going to be disparate impact, if you had any amount of discretion along the way in the process, then you would be legally liable for ungodly amounts of damages because that discretion would imply racism, and basically banks ended discretion. Bank of America, I think in 1996, instituted a policy where like they needed manual review for the decline of a application that was that had a racial minority in it. Famously, they did that for one of their branch locations. That was as early as 1996, after the CRA amendments. They got rid of brokers entirely in the process. Like, it used to be the case that like banks, because it wasn't their core business to like evaluate like loans, they would hire these like independent brokers with their own standards, and the loan would be underwritten by the bank, but it would be at the discretion of the brokers. But because of the way the liability was construed, because of the racial laws, the banks became liable for any discretion that brokers exercised, even if they were different companies. And so, banks basically, got in the business of race in a hardcore way. And Angelo Mozillo, as this video is going to go on to show, is like was the toast of the town in 2004, making money hand over fist. And not only that, he was doing it by being the world's foremost lender to racial minorities and Hispanics. So, like the article I just sent you in the lobby, you'll note at the bottom of it, right away, as soon as Clinton came into power, Mozillo made a hard turn into putting Countrywide Financial, like the leading lender of in the country, into getting the diversity dollars. So, like here at the bottom of the article, you'll see between 1993 and 1994, right? As soon as the CRA Reinvestment Act gets updated, the company's loans to African American borrowers rose 325% in a year, and to Hispanics 163% in a year. That's, I mean, most of the time it's like, okay, we increased it 3 to 5%. Good job. This is 325% in a single year. So, in this speech that I'm trying to find for you, which maybe I'll just put in the show notes after, he basically brags. He's like, guys, you want to know how I did it here in 2004, sitting on my millions? It's because racism is the world's largest financial and economic scourge. You have to understand that all people of all races, they have the exact same propensity to pay back loans. And so all the standards that you idiots are using for determining loans are racist. You have to understand they just, they will repay back at the same rates. And, this is how to make money. We are the number one lender to African Americans and Hispanics in the entire country. And, you guys too can see these riches if you just drop your credit standards and, as he said, treat everyone equally. But what that really means is you need to assume that, Asian females and black males are repaying loans at the exact identical rates, even when they come from radically different financial backgrounds. Doesn't make any sense. But
I had heard of the real estate crisis, but I didn't know. You're essentially saying there is a huge racial component to this crisis.
It's not even close. The Hispanics and African Americans defaulted on the loans overwhelmingly, like more than white homeowners. I mean, it was like, I'll try to get you the exact numbers, but it was ridiculous. It was a scandal. I mean, it was a national scandal, and it actually was for about a month or two before they got called racist and they stopped talking about it. But for example, I just sent you an article from VDare. It's an old Steve Saylor article. So some other stuff that Mozilla would do is, he implored government regulators to allow more zero down payment loans and liar loans in the name of fighting racist redlining. Redlining meant the practice of walling off of banks not serving people in certain zip codes because they just they deem the entire zip code to be sort of a credit risk, and they don't have enough sort of manpower to kind of exercise discretion, and so they just kind of write off the whole thing. What's really interesting, actually, I went back and I looked at the sample like language from these banks during the redlining era. This was during Jim Crow, before 1965. Really, I mean, it was before FHA and CRA and all that stuff. And one of the metrics that banks would often use for how creditworthy an area was how homogenous it was. They didn't even use racial language. They just said, is there homogeneity, cultural homogeneity, and it did just kind of instantly stick out. Like, man, back then they understood the Robert Putnam diversity and cohesion, like inverse relationship. Like, they understood that
they reverse engineered it.
Yeah, but what's really interesting actually is all of these banks have had to pay hundreds of millions of dollars, some billions of dollars, because of reverse redlining. So, what happened? The CRA, and gets us back to sort of Starbucks and the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act. The Community Reinvestment Act was done in part to end redlining. That is to end the practice of uh, of uh, of not lending to certain
Discrimination.
neighborhoods.
Yeah.
But it created a whole when the entire ecosystem collapsed, it created a whole new theory of law that you could be liable under, which was called reverse redlining, which meant offering too many subprime loans to people in areas that you went into to avoid not redlining. Do you understand? Like, they created a whole new theory of predatory lending, of going into these Black and Hispanic. Basically, they sued them for hundreds of millions of dollars for not giving enough loans. And then they gave too many loans, and then they were sued for reverse redlining. So let me show you what redlining looks like, because it actually is important for understanding kind of like the Starbucks sort of real estate
Just to
community
understand the reverse redlining, why would it be a problem that you give too much loans in an area? Is it the other people outside the area that are suing you for being irresponsible?
No, it's because it's the idea that the nature of the loans, you knew they wouldn't be able to pay them back. See, one of the things that Mozilla and the other diversity lenders who got rich off of these diversity politics, um, did was they pioneered something called like the ninja loan. No income, no job applications, ninja applications. Basically, you have no job, you have no money coming in, but you can still take on a 10 or 30-year mortgage on a house.
Okay.
And but they got away with this because in the beginning, and the whole reason it didn't collapse right away is because it happened to coincide with a fancy new economic instrument called the securitized loan, the collateralized debt obligations, CDOs, which basically meant that other people besides the banks were going to be largely liable for the debt for these shitty loans that were going to these Black and Hispanic communities through subprime. So, for
And
example,
was it
Fannie
invented
Mae.
by the private sector? Who invented this debt obligation thing?
Oh, the private sector invented it. But there had been, I mean, securitization has been around for a long time. That just means rolling up assets into a tradable security. So, for example, you have a bunch of loans. So here, I'm going to pull up on my screen now so that you can see what it looks like, what redlining looks like, and then I'll answer your question on this. Give me a second while I screen share. Okay. Can you see this on the page?
Yeah, we can see it.
So this is part of how you. This is a page from the FDIC's CRA compliance manual, and they give a bunch of examples here for when you will be. In order to remember, you're fucked if you don't have a satisfactory rating in your CRA. No government approvals, no doing business in Chicago or New York or LA or Miami or whatever. And meanwhile, all of your rivals do. And also remember, at the time, Fannie Mae was buying countrywide's shitty loans, the loans that were not being that would not be paid back. Okay, so you had all of these assets on the book for the bank, right? Like 30 years worth of mortgage payments. Let's say that totals $1 million in total over 30 years. Okay, that's an asset. And then they also have, four more. Okay, four more assets, which are basically like the amount of payments coming in over a 30-year period. And then you adjust the value of them by the risk of them not being repaid. Because if you don't get repaid, if the lenders don't repay, you don't get the money. So let's just say they were 5 houses that there were mortgages on. There were 5 mortgages. Each one has $1 million lifetime value. And one of them has 100% chance of being repaid. Another one is a 0% chance of being repaid. Another one is 25, another 50, another 75, right? So they're all in the middle.
Yeah.
So what what securitization involved and what allowed the diversity industry in the housing bubble to flourish until it popped was that initially the banks were not the ones, the originators of the loan were not the ones responsible, like for, it didn't matter to them whether or not the loan got repaid, because they would sell the rights to the assets to somebody else. Okay, so here's an
Okay.
example of how this works.
So
All
they
right,
were
so
essentially just an outlet. They were just selling loans without care for the loan being repayable, most likely.
right. All that mattered is that they got the fees and that they did the origination, and they just pumped out a ton and ton of them, and then they sold them. They sold the rights to the stream. That is, they sold them as a. They didn't call it an asset anymore. They called it a security, and then they sold the security to somebody else. They sold it to you. So UJF would now have the rights to 5 years, to 5 different mortgages coming in, and that might
Okay.
have a different value to you than to the bank. And so initially, Angelo Mozillo, there's some amazing emails and stories of how he twisted, um, uh, the head of Fannie Mae into buying up all these minority mortgage loans. And I think it was Frank Raines, someone Raines, Franklin. I think it was Franklin Raines, who was the head of Fannie Mae at the time, and how Fannie Mae and how he was the black head of, not the FHA. He was the black head of one of the enforcement czars, and he basically was all for it because of how much credit would buy him with the diversity industry. And there was this whole unholy alliance of nobody of the people who were exploiting diversity politics not having to pay the price for it. But here's how these CRA credits work. Let me just run through an example so that you can see the dirtiness. Okay. So here is, the back of a page here. What you need to do if you're a lending institution, in order to comply with a CRA, you need to do a annual CRA report with a dedicated CRA team. So you often need a whole new division of your company with a bunch of employees. And then you do a assessment area of all of the different counties that you do business in, and then the racial demographics of each and every single one of them, and then your proportions of loans to all of the different racial minorities in those. And because of these anti-redlining laws, the FDIC and OEFA and these other regulators would determine whether or not you are assessing the area correctly based on whether or not you're avoiding Black and Hispanic people. So here's an example, right? This bank, it has all these loans in County A, and in its CRA assessment report, it says the only county that we are responsible for our Community Reinvestment Act reporting is this one, the one where we have all these loans. The black dots are loans, and the yellow areas are majority minority census tracts. So this gets us into the explicitly racial angle of real estate and of real estate development and of big banks and of, it maybe, in another series on these business things. But so what would happen is they would take the latest census data. If it is a majority non-white neighborhood, notice how the bank has all these loans in County A, but it has a lot of loans in County D.
Mm-hmm.
But they're only reporting CRA compliance in County A. But because they are doing business in County D, a substantial amount of business in County D, what the regulators can do is they can say, no, you are actually liable under the Community Reinvestment Act for not just County A and not just County D where you have business, but also in County B, because there's a substantial number of majority Black census tracts there. Do you
In
understand?
other words, you cannot hop over uh, counties that are overwhelmingly Black.
Yes, you can't hop over them, and you can't even have a lesser proportion of loans in that area that you've hopped over to do, because what it will now, remember, this is perfectly logical as a non-racist bank. right? Because it could be the case that the people in County B are systematically terrible credit risks. No jobs, no income, poor FICO scores, poor credit histories, behind on their utilities. And it could be that County D is just so happens that they've located a few good ones, but their prime business is in A. But no, now if they want to do business in County A, they are going to need to start making loans to County B and County D. Now, I'm going to turn off screen share for a second here because I want to show you just how fucking ugly it got in the 2000s with what they forced these banks to do. And the banks didn't want to do it at first, but then because of securitization, they ended up being able to hot a lot of them until the whole thing came down. Hot potato the risks off to Fannie and Freddie and other financial institutions who would buy it. So they didn't care about getting paid back after a while because
So
they're
there
making
is
so
a
much in
big
fees.
missing part of the story when they say the financial crisis was due to bad securities. It's really the tip of the iceberg. It was based
Oh,
on bad securities that were a patch for bad laws and bad anti-discrimination laws.
yeah. In fact, here let's see if I can. I want to play you a bunch more clips. We only have 10 minutes left. I mean, this should be an episode by itself, JF, because there's so much more to get into, and the whole thing is absolutely stunning. And you get in this long enough, you start to see patterns, like like you like the reason that this stood up to me about the Starbucks thing is because what ended up happening was you started getting CRA credit for buying up like black majority loans and things like this. And part of how you were scored with CRA compliance was on your creativity. I'm going to try to find you the exact citations for a lot of this stuff. But you were scored on your creativity, like on how creative you could get to make sure that there were that your sense uh, that you were serving County B, even though they were terrible credit risks. But
Yeah.
this is massive, 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 affirmative action here on with respect to real estate and lending. Now, there are there's a great article here actually that I'll just pull it up on my own screen. Um,
So we will keep the subject separate for the real estate for another stream. However, there's an important question that I want us to address within the last 10 minutes. That I see the parallels between the real estate situation that you show us and the Starbucks stories. It's the strong arm of the state first being used for anti-discrimination laws, and it leads agents within the economy to do irrational decisions. Now I wonder what will happen with Starbucks. Will there be the equivalent of a bubble due to these actions being irrational? Will it build up and will it make Starbucks fail? Or is Starbucks intelligent enough to not have its own bubble like this?
Well, remember that was what was so interesting about them shutting down 150 stores. That they announced that they are going to start moving into more suburban and rural areas, and that in 2019 they're shutting down 150 stores. They've declared that the urban doing business in these urban areas has been less and less profitable for them because of the regulatory approvals and zoning and other kinds of local regulations. So, there is a very interesting. I mean, they literally said that, JF. I mean, that's a pretty solid like confirmation on the fact that right, everything it starts as a cause, becomes a business, and it degenerates into a racket. We are very clearly in the racket phase of this, but it could be that it's not until really the past year or so that it's finally these institutions are now so powerful that Starbucks uh, might not be able to do the same tricks to dominate those neighborhoods. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So Starbucks would be smarter than the banks were as far as how it approaches these irrational environments.
Yeah, although Starbucks is not subject to the same sorts of systemic risks because it's such low dollar stuff. They're like these are not trillions of dollars in loan and securitized loans. This is $4 coffee and $1 million real estate, which they can just flip the moment they
Yeah.
need to get out of town. So I don't think Starbucks is. I actually think Starbucks. I listened to a recent talk by Howard Schultz on what his vision for the future is on things, and I actually think that um, if they can make the transition into uh, if they can make a soft transition, they actually may be extraordinarily well positioned as a because I'm big on like futurist technology and like virtual reality and augmented reality and shit like that. I do think that's going to totally change the world. And I think that what Starbucks is sort of building to is the ability to have like a public third place in wealthy parts of town where you can kind of stay for free, but there's all sorts of shit like that you can do there that could monetize space. I mean, they have 15,000 stores worldwide. They're getting into China, and their big growth plan is China, not the inner city. And it could be that a lot of this is cyclical. Like often, Starbucks moves in right after a crash, like right when the early stages of gentrification set in. Like they're not dumb. They coordinate with the real estate developers. That's why it's such a political business, the developer Democrat complex. It's also why they're all lefties. But I mean, there's a reason Howard Schultz might be running for president. Like, this is a highly connected relationship business where who you know and who owes you favors and who you can do favors to is a huge part of regulatory compliance and competitive strategy. And I do think that, especially, there's always going to be a need for poor Black and Hispanic communities to need white and Jewish money. There just is. Like there's, I mean, maybe that will change to some extent in the distant future, but as long as that need arises, there will always be an opportunistic Starbucks on a block near you where you might want to eat there, but the locals do not
That's
until the
absolutely
locals get replaced.
fascinating. And also, it makes me think of something. A lot of people are asking me, Jeff, aren't you alarmed about trust? Um, trust, antitrust law. As a libertarian, I'm not so much for antitrust law, and I don't mind that much about trust. And however disgusting the system you demonstrate to us today is, I will say this is why a big company accumulating money is not so dangerous, even in a libertarian order. It's because there are people who are willing to take chunks at these big companies in all sorts of various ways. There are people who specialize in draining money out of these companies. And I believe that what Frame Game has been describing for this three-part series is it's the people at the bottom draining money in all sorts of ways from big companies, and big companies accepting to do it because they want to play the game, because they feel they can have a winning end.
And not just that, it has gone from being just like it was in the financial crisis. It has gone from being something that they did at first grudgingly and then happily, because what it does is it keeps competitors out.
Absolutely.
Like because what it means is that if you're a small business and you want to set up a coffee shop, in a local gentrifying neighborhood that where Starbucks owns the local city council, then you need big bucks to pay off the local city council to make sure that you can, the exclusivity clauses are banned in that zoning area. Or, I mean, when you combine the real estate strategy with the exclusivity strategy, it makes the whole thing very ugly. I did, since we have a few more minutes, can I just show like some citations real quick for some of the things that I talked
we
about?
will conclude on your citations.
Okay.
I will read a few super chats before we get to it. Secret Genius says, good to see you guys after a month. Sargon has uploaded the Manhattan panel where someone asked him about FGR. You can find it on Sargon's channel. I'll go check out because I don't know what Sargon thinks about you. Have you watched this video?
No, I haven't seen it.
All right, so let's
I've been
have a look
sort
at
of,
it tonight.
yeah.
And Fernando Covet says, Brazilification? No! Otaku says, I'll give you some money, but I won't lend you anymore. Well, I'm totally fine with the money giving. I think I'm turned off from loans based on what Frame Game told us today. Tara H says, I worked at Starbucks for a short period of time. It was a lamentable experience. Starbucks puts politics, diversity over all. Love the show, JF and Frame Game. Well, thank you. Frame Game, do you have anything to say in conclusion?
I have a few things. I wanted to hit you with a massive white pill about this stuff, but I think I'm going to save it for next week. Could we do a CRA thing next week? I honestly think you and I could create a couple hour overview that will, that is just extremely powerful because of how big of an issue that the 2008 financial crisis was, how fresh it still is in the minds of these sort of cultural.
Well, definitely
zeitgeist.
That's a good subject for next week because I was not at all aware of this reality, and you just opened my eyes with this. When people say subprimes were the problem, the securities were bad, the incentives were bad, why don't you say it? It was a racial issue. We've tried to impose something on another race based on standards that have been established for other people, and the other race was not able to pay as much. That's what happened.
Yeah, and the shame about it all, again, because at the end of the day, I actually, I am sort of a heart-right guy, and I do believe that, treating everybody equally. It's just disparate impact is the enemy of the people. And the thing is, when you stop thinking about things in terms of merit and you stop thinking about things in terms of who they are and what they've accomplished with their life, and they just become a racial statistic, that is a losing game every time. And maybe next week we'll explore that in more detail. But it's 10 o'clock, and thank you very much, JF. Thank you to the audience, and we'll talk very soon.
Thanks to you, and everyone, go see Alze's channel. He will be starting a debate very soon, and as far as I'm concerned, I will be on Dave Martel's podcast at midnight. Bye-bye.